Good morning, and welcome to today's webinar on engaging the private sector in National Adaptation Planning process. My name is Christian Ledwell, and I'm the coordinator of the NAP Global Network Secretariat, which is hosted by the International Institute for Sustainable Development. The NAP Global Network is an initiative that works to enhance national adaptation planning and action in developing countries. The network was established at the end of 2014 at COP20 in Lima by developing countries and bilateral donors who recognize the growing importance of NAP processes as the foundations for effective adaptation action. Funding for the NAP Global Network has been provided by Germany, the United States, Canada, and Austria. The network now connects over 1,000 participants from more than 135 countries. Through our activities, we facilitate sustained peer learning and exchange on what works and what doesn't work in NAP processes. We support national level action, delivering technical assistance on the NAP process, and we enhance bilateral support for adaptation through donor coordination with developing countries at the table to ensure that donors' support aligns with their adaptation priorities. Through all of these activities, we develop analysis, communication, and knowledge products on what makes for effective national adaptation planning. One knowledge product that I'd like to highlight is a guidance note that was just mentioned in the video on private sector engagement, which you can download from the handout section on the webinar dashboard. Today's webinar is going to focus on how governments can engage the private sector in NAP processes. This builds on conversations that we've been having with country representatives over the past year, including at a peer learning summit in Netherlands earlier this summer, where we were fortunate to have representatives from 12 countries, including Jamaica and St. Lucia, who you'll hear from today. And pictured bottom right here is Diane Ashton-Smith, who you'll hear from second on today's webinar. For the webinar agenda today, first we're going to hear from Alec Crawford from the NAP Global Network Secretariat, who will provide an overview on private sector engagement in NAP processes. Second, we'll hear from Diane Ashton-Smith from Red Stripe Beer based in Jamaica, who will share a private sector perspective on what it's like to engage in the National Adaptation Plan process in Jamaica. Third, we'll hear from Snalia Mahal from the Government of St. Lucia's Department of Sustainable Development, who will share lessons from St. Lucia's experience with developing a private sector engagement strategy for their NAP process. Following the presentations, we'd like to hear from you during the question and answer session. Please write your questions in the dedicated question space on your GoToWebinar dashboard, as is shown in this slide. And so, to get us started, I'm going to pass the mic over to Alec Crawford, who will walk us through an overview on what private sector engagement looks like.
Thanks very much, Christian. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So thanks for the introduction. I'm Alec Crawford. I work for the NAP Global Network. In response to demand from our members and from development partners, we earlier this year developed and released some initial guidance on how countries can engage in the private sector in their NAP processes. So this is very much about bringing in not only private finance, but also private enterprises into the planning, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation of national adaptation planning processes. So thanks very much to everyone for joining us for the webinar today. And thank you very much, Diane and Snalia, also for joining us to lend their perspectives from both the private sector and from government. So I thought that I'd start. It's a cold, snowy morning in Toronto, where I'm based. So I thought I would start with some tea this morning, just to set the scene for the guidance. I wanted to take you through a story from Rwanda. So one of the case studies that we came across as we were developing the report was an initiative that was done by a local NGO called ArcosNet with support from GIZ, which focused on, over the course of 2017 and 2018, bringing private sector actors within Rwanda into adaptation planning processes, specifically the NAP and the NDC. They had a couple of national level dialogues within this process, and as part of one of them, they had a presentation from a company called Suarte, which is a Rwandan-based company, one of the big players in the tea industry, which is very important to the domestic economy in Rwanda. And they played a very important role in this meeting in that they were able to tell the story of why they had made the switch toward climate resilient agriculture and production for their tea. they recognized in about 2009 that they needed to make the switch towards more sustainable agricultural practices because they saw that climate change was having an adverse effect on their production. So they made that switch. And at these meetings that again were organized in 2017, 2018, they were able to really kind of make the case to other private sector actors that were in the room, as well as civil society actors, that there was a business case for making investments in adaptation, that the investments were actually in the large scale of their kind of costs and expenses, not that significant, and that the business was thriving as a result of those investments. So as a result of those presentations and the kind of promotion of this transition by Suarte, there was quite a bit of interest and uptake from other private sector actors that were in the room. They were kind of, it helps to make the case for them to invest in adaptation when they hear it coming from one of their colleagues within the sector. So why should the private sector be involved in the NAP process specifically? Well, we saw that there's growing recognition across the board that adaptation is not going to be the business of governments alone. They can't do this alone. There has to be multiple stakeholders involved in national adaptation planning processes, from civil society to multilateral institutions to bilateral donors. But the private sector is going to be a key part of it as well. And that's the domestic private sector as well as international or multinational companies. Why is that? Well, they're a key engine of economic growth in developing countries. So there's 60% of GDP comes from the private sector, 80% of capital flow, and crucially 90% of jobs. So it's going to be very hard to build a climate resilient society if people aren't employed, if those jobs aren't there, and the private sector is going to be largely responsible for that. So they're going to be a key player in this. What role can they play? Well, through our research, we found that there were three kind of main ways in which the private sector can contribute to adaptation planning. They're going to be creating the jobs, as I said, needed to support adaptation. They're going to be hopefully developing the goods and services needed for societies to become more climate resilient, and I'll get into a bit more detail on that later. And then finally, of course, there's the question of money. I don't think the expectation is that all of the money is going to come from the private sector, but nonetheless, there's a recognition that private sector actors will be financing, whether it's directly or indirectly, many adaptation actions. So you could have, a commercial bank directly financing adaptation action, whether through a public-private partnership with government or through the actions of a private sector actor who needs investments in their operations. Or you could have a company, and we're going to hear from one in just a moment, investing in, again, their own operations and their own supply chain in such a way that it increases the resilience, not only of that operation, but also of course, the employees and the communities that they work in, and so on. So they will be involved, they'll be needed for a number of reasons. This table or figure is adapted from a useful one that was put out by UNEP, specifically UNEP's finance initiative. And it really kind of breaks down who we're talking about when we talk about the private sector. So as you can see on the graphic, we're referring to both private enterprises, the kind of first orange row that you see there, as well as private financiers. We don't just want to be talking about, where's the money going to come from? We're talking about things like micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, to larger corporations, multinational corporations, and then at the very high end of the private enterprises row, you see infrastructure projects. On the private financier side of things, we'd like for you to keep in mind everything from microfinance institutions at the smaller scale of needed investment, right through commercial banks, capital markets, institutional investors. As you can see at the top, when it comes to adaptation, there's going to be a whole range of financing that's required. We're not strictly talking about kind of massive investments in climate resilient infrastructure of over $10 million. We're also talking about smaller investments by micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises in their operations. So, maybe all that's needed is $1,000 to invest in a family farm. We want to talk and think about the whole range of financing that's going to be required. And as you'll see at the bottom of the figure, there are financial instruments that line up quite nicely with the scale of financing that's required. So you can think about microloans for smaller projects. You can think about corporate loans, venture capital, corporate bonds, and then project finance for the bigger infrastructure projects. I just want to flag that MSMEs, or micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, are particularly important here. They're in developing countries overwhelmingly a part of the economy. They represent 90% of all businesses in those contexts, and many of the actors, particularly those working in climate-dependent sectors like agriculture and water, are going to be uniquely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So, you have those that are operating in the formal economy and the informal sector as well. I'm talking about smallholder farmers, street vendors, informal cab drivers, those sorts of actors. Both groups are going to be a crucial part of this equation. They're often going to be unaware of the risks and opportunities presented by climate change, and they may not have enough financial or human resources to assess the risks that climate change poses to their operations and to respond accordingly. They might also prioritize more pressing and immediate short-term issues and profit maximization goals in their operations and investment decisions. So, adapting to a long-term change in the climate is not often a priority when you just have to see through the week, essentially, in your operation. Nevertheless, because of the scale of these operations in developing countries, when we're talking about, again, 90% of all businesses, they're going to be a key player here, and finding a way as a government to reach them is going to be crucial, whether it's through business associations or business multipliers. The government really does have to try to crack that nut. So what's the business case for adaptation? It's often difficult to make this case with the private sector. Maybe increasingly easy, but traditionally it's been quite difficult because these are what many perceive to be uncertain risks that are projected long in the future, and that might not line up with the business cycles or the business planning cycles of a private sector actor. So when you're talking about the private sector, you're obviously talking about risk and reward, or risk and return, I should say. So they're really making the equation about, okay, well, if we invest in adaptation, what is our expected return from that investment? And it's often been difficult to make the argument that the return makes it very much worth it to make that investment. Nevertheless, we kind of define the business case in three ways. So we see that the reason that private sector actors should invest in adaptation are, one, to manage risks to business continuity and reputation. So when it comes to business continuity, we're talking about risks to both the operation and to the supply chain. We're talking about physical risks, so risks to assets, risks to staff, those kinds of risks, as well as transitional risks. So something that applies in my country is, if you're operating a ski resort, for example, you want to invest in adaptation because, the winters might be getting shorter and the snow melt might be happening earlier. So you have to adjust your business accordingly. Reputation is, of course, also important and increasingly important. If you're seen as a private sector actor that's not doing their part, both on climate change mitigation, but also on adaptation, there's a significant reputational risk that you have to keep in mind. The second point is capitalizing on new markets and business opportunities. And this is really about, seeing the changing climate as a business opportunity as well as a challenge. And a lot of businesses do see it as such. So they recognize the fact that, new products and new markets may be emerging as the climate changes and as society needs to adapt to those changes. So, are you going to be the company that develops an increasingly water efficient irrigation system for the local market, or a new seed variety that is more drought resistant? Or are you going to develop an early warning system for weather events that could negatively impact businesses operating in the area? So there are opportunities that should be kept in mind when it comes to a changing climate as well. The final one is complying with policies, regulations, and investor interests. And this is really about, again, responding to signals that are coming from the government and that are coming from the investment community. On the latter, we're increasingly seeing regulations, but also investor interest in climate risk disclosure. So investors are increasingly asked to disclose the risk that their portfolios are exposed to when it comes to climate change. And if they're being asked to do that, you can expect that they're increasingly looking at the companies that they're investing in to ensure that those risks are being minimized, actively minimized. And that can happen, of course, through adaptation investments. Just to take you through a couple of anecdotal examples. This is a crop that's very close to my heart, cocoa. In Ghana, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire being, principal production points for cocoa crops, they have recognized that, of course, the crop is exposed to climate risk. And in response, in 2015, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which is an organization that represents more than 200 leading global businesses, they initiated a project to install weather stations and systems in Ghana in order to provide 7,500 smallholder farmers and local community members with valuable localized weather information. So they recognize the fact that these private sector actors didn't necessarily have that information, and that by providing it, it could very much increase their adaptive capacity in the investments that they made in adaptation. So with private sector partners, including Kellogg, Olam International, and Opus Insights, these kind of larger multinational corporations recognized that their supply chains were threatened by climate change. So they were happy to support the project, but they again invested in weather stations. They held stakeholder dialogues with these relevant stakeholders on the ground in Ghana. They also decided on which communication channels would be most effective at getting the messaging to the people who needed it. So overall, it was a way of getting that information in the hands of the people who could best use it. The next story is from Zimbabwe. This is a local brewery operating in Zimbabwe that recognized the fact that if they could produce a beer from red sorghum in place of barley malt, they could produce a more climate resilient beer. So red sorghum is much more climate resilient than those that are typically grown in the region. So they developed a new product that was not only more climate resilient, there was demand for it at the local level, but also they were able to support farmers in the region who kind of switched over their production to red sorghum. Again, a much more climate resilient crop, and therefore a much more climate resilient supply chain for that beer company. The next picture, this is international superstar Will Smith. This is a story from California. As you all know, California is really struggling with wildfires at the moment, both this year and last. And in California now, we're seeing that utility companies, for example, can be held liable for wildfire damage if the company caused the blaze, regardless of whether they were found to be negligent. So negligence doesn't matter. If they caused the wildfire, then they're held liable for it. So what we saw in California last year was Pacific Gas and Electric, which was implicated in the fires in that state from 2018, had to file for bankruptcy because they were liable for at least some of those fires. So we see that companies can also support adaptation activities in order to reduce the potential liabilities that they might face as a result of climate change. Looking at the NAP process, this is a useful diagram that we've come up with within the Secretariat that covers kind of both planning, implementation, and monitoring phases of the process. But you'll see in that central wheel, within the guidance note, what we like to focus on is the enabling factors that governments can put in place in order to support, again, private sector engagement in national adaptation planning. We've broken this up in 4 ways. So we look at information sharing, that comes up again and again when we talk to private sector actors. And this is really about ensuring that they understand climate change, that they understand the impacts that it's going to have on their operations, and then also that they understand what adaptation options are available to them. On the financing side of things, it's about, can private sector actors access the financing that they need in order to adapt? And is that financing coming in the right form? Is it coming in a form that is, again, lined up, thinking back to that figure that I presented earlier, is it lined up with the kind of project that they're interested in? Institutional arrangements deals with not only kind of dialogue between the government and the private sector, but also the laws and policies that are in place that might support investment in adaptation from the private sector. And on the capacity development side, again, does the private sector have the capacity that it needs to understand climate information and to respond to it? And we see that this engagement can happen throughout the NAP process. So it can happen during the planning. That's important that it does happen in the planning, and it might mean that the government develops something like a private sector engagement strategy. It can happen through the implementation phase. A good example of this might be a public-private partnership project, typically around infrastructure, but not necessarily exclusively. But again, you can really get them involved in actually implementing adaptation actions throughout the NAP process. And then finally, monitoring and evaluation. How can they be part of the process of making sure that the actions that are being taken are effectively reducing vulnerabilities to climate change in the long run? So just in closing, what can governments do to engage the private sector in NAP processes? We see a few things that they can do. There's more, I'm sure, but one thing is generate and communicate climate data and information. They can support research and development for adaptation. They can try to articulate to a greater extent the business case for adaptation. They can work to build the capacity of private sector actors to understand and respond to climate vulnerability and risk. They can use the NAP process to communicate the country's medium and long-term adaptation priorities. So kind of using the NAP process as a signal to send to the private sector that says, this is where we're going when it comes to adaptation, and we'd like you to come on board. They can explore, as I said, developing a private sector engagement strategy for the NAP. They can understand NAP financing needs early and try to develop a feasible, bankable project pipeline for what needs to happen, and getting private sector input in that process makes a lot of sense. And they can identify and cultivate private sector champions and share stories of success and failure to promote crowding in. And a great story of success that we're going to listen to next is from our colleagues at Red Stripe. So I'm going to leave you with that tantalizing image of a cold beer. Hopefully where you are is warmer than I am. But thank you very much, and looking forward to your question.
Thanks very much, Alec. So next on the agenda, we have Diane Ashton-Smith from Red Stripe Beer, who, as Alec mentioned, is a great private sector champion for adaptation. So she's going to walk us through how Red Stripe Beer has engaged in the National Adaptation Planning process in Jamaica. Over to you, Diane.
Thank you so much, Christian. It's really a pleasure to be here. I am just going to make sure I show my screen in presentation mode. So there we go. Is everybody seeing my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, wonderful. So first of all, really want to say thank you to the organizers for this opportunity to present on behalf of a company of which I am absolutely proud to represent. It is Red Stripe. And this story started 100 years ago when two young Jamaican men, over a handshake, started a company called Deno and Geddes, where they manufactured and distributed mineral water and sodas. And 10 years later, in 1928, they realized their dream of creating a beer of quality and world-class standards. A beer that was described by a newspaper columnist as one that transcended the capacity of mere colonialists. And that's the power of Red Stripe, that is known the world over, a beer and a company that has withstood the test of time and which has adapted to changes of all kinds: political, social, climate, environmental, cultural, and even change of ownership. From a family-owned business, Red Stripe has had a change in fathers, from Guinness to Diageo and now to Heineken, which acquired Red Stripe in 2016, giving us global access and reach and global expertise and processes. So what does adaptation have to do with Red Stripe Bear? The answer is it has everything to do with it. And our adaptation approach is steeped in our sustainability development agenda, which is really two ideas. First, it is a way to understand our complicated world. How do the economic, the social, the environmental, the political, and the cultural factors fit together? And secondly, the idea of sensible goals for our complex interconnected planet with some 10 billion inhabitants. How do we make the world both prosperous, fair, and also environmentally sustainable so that our numbers and our economy don't overrun the physical planet itself? And more specifically, why do we do it? Well, it's what I call the 3 C's: climate change, or commitment to the COP21 Paris Agreement, and conscious choice. Increasingly, consumer tastes and preferences are shifting to purposeful brands and brands that are committed to sustainability and are not creating negative impacts to the environment. Just as we heard from Alex earlier, there are 3 things that we consider as well. It's around managing risks. It's also about capitalizing on new opportunities. And as he mentioned, complying with policy regulations and certainly our investor interests. So it is out of this recognition, Heineken developed an adaptation approach to sustainability through 6 priorities that quite aptly we call brewing a better world. And this approach is about creating shared value from barley to bar, and in the case of Red Stripe, from cassava to consumer. The primary goal being to brew a better world, to brew a better Jamaica across our entire value chain, from the raw materials we secure sustainably to our suppliers or brewing processes or packaging material, through to how we transport and distribute our goods to our customers, communities, and consumers. And all our activities along the value chain, we know, has an impact on the environment. And with the changes that we've seen in our climatic conditions, such as flooding in previously dry areas, to reduced rainfall in areas that traditionally had abundant rainfall, Red Stripe has proactively adopted as a business principle an approach that seeks to develop strategies that will reduce our impact and adapt to current and future events. It's all about creating shared value for our stakeholders and while contributing to the UN Sustainable Goals. And so for the purposes of this presentation, I will focus on 3 of our priority areas where there is direct linkage to 5 of the SDGs. So drop the C, as you see, which is about reducing CO2 emissions. Every drop, which is about protecting our water resource and sourcing sustainably, all of which support the delivery of Vision 2030. That's Jamaica's Vision 2030, a place of choice to live, work, raise families, and do business. And more importantly, Jamaica's National Adaptation Plan, which falls under the Jamaica National Development Plan 2030, which addresses climate risks as a national development priority. So just to share with you very quickly, in 2017, we decided to reduce our carbon footprint here at Red Stripe, switching from LPG to the use of LNG to run our CHP plant, which is our combined heat and power plant. And in November 2018, the conversion of boilers from heavy fuel oil to LNG was completed. And based on the final air dispersion model report dated September 2018, submitted to NEPA, we achieved a significant reduction in pollutants emitted from our site with the use of LNG. Now you will see here in this slide that working with a number of other private sector organizations have helped us in developing this whole dropping of the sea mandate that we have. We've worked with the New Fortress Energy for the use of LNG, and we're also working with tertiary institutions for research and development. Secondly, this year we launched what we called our Red Stripe Red Cycling Initiative. Sustainability informs all we do at Red Stripe, and as part of our Drop the Sea initiative, we realized that we needed to provide a greater incentive for closed loop recycling of bottles, in which bottles come back into the production cycle and are cleaned and refilled with the same product. And while everyone wants to do what's good for the planet, the low value of returning bottles made it easy for consumers to discard them. And recycling figures declined over the last 10 years, coming from a high in 2009 with 95% of bottles being recycled to just 85% in 2018. And so we recognized that we had to increase this initiative and introduced what we call bottlepreneurs in our Red Cycle initiative. We also increased our bottle deposits, so we see less of our bottles ending up in the landfills. We have seen tremendous success as a result of this, and consequently, our recycling has increased from the low of 85% to over 100% in the last year. We've also launched what we call our circular economy, and this is where we use our waste back into productive enterprise, ensuring that fewer of our waste, less of our waste goes into the landfill. And what we've started to do is segregation of our waste to ensure, as I mentioned, does not go into the landfill. We are working with companies such as 360 Recycle Manufacturing to help establish this circular economy, because once we determine how much waste we are producing and the types of waste, collecting all of this data, we can then go to the public and say to them, here it is, we have all of this waste. What can you do so that it does not end up in the waste, but it can create employment and productive enterprise for Jamaicans within the communities which we operate. The second thing that we focus on as well is every drop, protecting our water resources. But I think more importantly, everybody wants to hear about sourcing sustainably. These are crucial for our business. It means an increase in agricultural productivity while protecting natural resources. It means securing our supplies through reducing risks and volatility in our raw material supply chain. So Project Grow is really our baby. It is a local sourcing program where we seek to replace 40% of imported high maltose corn syrup we use in our brewing process with locally grown cassava. This is an initiative that creates a level of pride for employees and tremendous goodwill with government, who have been solid partners in this project. Additionally, we are working with over 100 farmers, sole proprietors, and firms farming on approximately 1,000 acres to cultivate cassava. We also work with Persan, a company that provides us with fertilizers, chemicals, and land preparation to ensure that we're utilizing the best goods and methods that are also climate smart for soil conservation. We know that cassava is also highly climate resilient. However, with the increase in drought conditions, for us to get the highest yield from cassava, we have to ensure that there is water to supply these. And so we've implemented a number of adaptation techniques that we apply in our own farms, and as well that we share with those farmers that we contract to ensure that we have the sustainability of this project. We ensure too that we're working very smartly with government, who have, as I mentioned, been solid partners. They have provided us with lands at reduced lease costs for long-term lease, over 1,700 acres. They provide us with technical support provided through the Ministry of Industry, Commerce, Agriculture and Fisheries Research Division, as they are our lead on the research activities. And they sit on a steering committee that provides oversight and technical direction to Project Grow. It is this advice that has actually helped us to identify the varieties that are best suited for the varying geographical locations of our contracted farmers based on climatic conditions and soil type. And it is through their research as well that we will also establish the preferred agronomic practices that will realize optimal output for the farmers. The other component of the research is to identify what crops can be grown with the cassava for economic value. That is, will provide an income for the farmers within the 9 months that it takes to grow the cassava, and to reduce production costs for weed control and provide nutritional replenishment for the soil if plowed back into the soil. Raw material, of course, is seen as a sustainable business decision by Red Stripe, as it supports growth of the agricultural sector, is adaptation in practice, and provides economic opportunities for rural communities. And through this program, we use cassava as it is less susceptible to damage from climatic conditions, pests, and disease. So what kinds of institutional arrangements have we put in place to effectively engage these actors in our adaptation planning? So with our farmers, there are very strict contracts that outline the conditions and of engagement and cultivation practices. We also establish workshops, meetings, and capacity building sessions. So we teach them all of the necessary practices that will ensure that their crops are climate resilient. We also provide technical assistance through the use of extension officers, and as well provide access to financing for our farmers at very low interest rates. We also have really solid agreements with suppliers. These suppliers are, of course, our farmers, and as well the suppliers of fertilizers. We have monthly meetings with them, and most recently we do have knowledge sharing fora where we share adaptation best practices and review government policy. 2 such sessions held today looked at climate smart cassava cultivation and watershed protection and water conservation, which included a wide cross-section of Jamaican industries, both private and public sector. How have we engaged in our country's NAP process? Through all of the things that I have mentioned. And as you perhaps know, I just wanted to share with you that for Jamaica, the National Adaptation process is really about reducing our risks to hazards and adaptation to climate change. The vision for Jamaica is that we will have increased Jamaica's ability to cope with natural and man-made hazards such as hurricanes, earthquakes, and to reduce loss of lives and property when these events occur. Beyond that, we want to ensure that we are protecting the environment. We are ensuring that Jamaicans have a country where it's environmentally sound, and we know that as a private sector organization, our role is increasingly more and more important in developing that. They have been solid partners with the Jamaican government. We have been part of the Uncut Conversations on Climate Change, and we know that through these knowledge sharing fora, more and more people will get involved in this work. And as we look ahead, we will continue on our journey to creating shared value and continuously adapt to creating more resilience in our business. And our success thus far has been largely due to the government support and their challenge to us as a business to share our business model and to continue to drive improvements and activities that will sustain our environment and provide solutions to our dilemma of sustained growth that makes the world both prosperous, fair, and also environmentally sustainable, so that our numbers and our economy don't overrun the physical planet itself. And there's no doubt more can be done to strengthen our public-private collaboration in the implementation of NAPs. What has worked for Red Stripe is our proactive approach. It's the right thing to do, and we have collaborated with government through speaking their language and supporting them in the delivery of their own NAP goals. The opportunities, however, as we see it, are for more collaboration. Beyond just developing our own adaptation plans, we'd love for them to bring us more to the table to provide data and analytics on the work being done to support the national goals. and co-creation for policy development specific to private sector integration into local support of NAP. We can help through our own expertise, act also as mentors to build greater communication and understanding. And finally, calibration through regulation. And a leading question for us is how can the government standardize and offer incentives or funding to organizations such as ourselves that are supportive in the NAP process? That said, we have engaged in it and we are a huge partner. The government has been tremendous support in this process. And it is really about us understanding that it's hugely important, our role as a private sector. And we are in the driver's seat to ensure that we deliver against these goals of government. Together, however, we can make this happen. And the time for action is now. Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much, Diane. Thank you very much for walking us through that really impressive work. So third today on the webinar, we're going to hear from Snalia Mahal, who is going to present on the Government of St. Lucia's experience developing a private sector engagement strategy. And just as a reminder, you can enter your questions as they come up in the right-hand side on the dashboard. So over to you, Snalia.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here to present on St. Lucia's private sector engagement during the National Adaptation Planning process. Unlike Alec, it's sunny and warm out here in Castries, St. Lucia, so I hope everybody is keeping warm wherever they are or cool wherever they are. So to begin, our National Adaptation Planning process in St. Lucia started in 2017, and in 2018, at our National Adaptation Plan Assembly, the National Adaptation Plan was launched. And together with it, we also launched 3 sectoral adaptation strategy and action plans for 3 sectors. Those are fisheries, agriculture, and water. And at the NAP Assembly, there was a strong recommendation by high-level stakeholders of the need to involve the private sector in climate change discussions. And of course, they also highlighted in the NAP that in our cross-sectoral measures, the importance of including the private sector in climate change discussions as well. And not only the private sector, but also civil society, media, and academia. And the composition of St. Lucia's private sector, of course, you would note that in a country like ours, many of the businesses that exist are micro, small, medium-sized enterprises, and many of them are family-owned enterprises. And 77% of those enterprises only have 5 or less employees. And those with more only account for 4% of the private sector. And in a baseline survey conducted in 2009, they estimated that there are 7,430 enterprises in St. Lucia, 39% of them considered informal. To continue the composition of the private sector in St. Lucia, we recognize that as mapped, there are a number of variables to consider when looking at the private sector in St. Lucia. We look at the size of the private sector, economic significance, sectoral orientation and representation, vulnerability, and capacity to implement climate change adaptation measures. Our private sector can therefore be categorized into some major sectors, which include agriculture, tourism, manufacturing, services, construction, engineering, infrastructure. And of course, when you look at the private sector, they're not only exclusive to tourism, manufacturing, and agriculture, but their reach is cross-cutting, and so there is some impact when you look at water, waste management, energy. In the National Adaptation Plan, in the cross-sectoral measures, it was highlighted that one of the major outcomes should be to increase capacities to design and implement climate change adaptation projects across the sectors. It was also highlighted that the private sector, as an important player in St. Lucia's climate change discussion, that it was recognized that there was low engagement and interest of civil society and the private sector, and those were recognized as threats to the NAP, the National Adaptation Planning process. In the NAP, it was also highlighted that one of the major adaptation measures that should be conducted was the development of a sectoral adaptation strategy and action plan for the private sector. That would include incentives for businesses to engage in climate change adaptation efforts and the creation of public-private partnerships for adaptation. The National Adaptation Plan therefore identified specific roles for our National Climate Change Committee, which included support to non-state actors, including community and private sector engagement in National Adaptation Plan. St. Lucia's National Climate Change Committee plays a critical role in the climate change coordination, information dissemination, and implementation of climate change initiatives in St. Lucia. And as previously mentioned, the NAP did highlight as an adaptation measure the development of a sectoral adaptation strategy and action plan for the private sector. And in 2018, St. Lucia began the development of its private sector engagement strategy for climate change. And we are currently in the process of finalizing this document. The private sector engagement strategy for climate change identifies the objectives for the private sector engagement in NAP financing, maps the relevant components of St. Lucian private sector for consideration of engagement modalities, and addresses how the public sector can encourage private sector engagement and investment in climate change adaptation. Some of the major objectives of the engagement strategy are education and information sharing on climate change adaptation, informing investment decisions in resilience building, informing development of public policy, just to highlight a few. During our national adaptation planning process, and more specifically through the private sector engagement strategy for climate change, we've held a number of initiatives. There's been a lot of consultations and involvement of private sector through workshops, one-on-one meetings, two private sector entities, that is the St. Lucia Hotel and Tourism Association and the St. Lucian Development Bank, along with members of agencies in the public sector, attended a peer learning summit, which looked at engaging the private sector in national adaptation planning processes. We've also, through the private sector engagement strategy process, put together a public-private concept note for funding, which looks at green affordable housing, led by the St. Lucia Development Bank. During this national adaptation planning process, a climate financing strategy is also in its final stages of development. This climate financing strategy, it outlines the public and private sources of climate financing available both domestically and internationally. And this will ensure that the resources available to St. Lucia for the achievement of its NAP objectives are appropriate and commensurate to its needs. During the national adaptation planning process and the private sector engagement strategy process, It was highlighted that there are a number of opportunities for engagement with the private sector, and some of these include presentations during established board meetings, business breakfasts, WhatsApp groups, email groups. It is noted that a lot of the time that the private sector cannot necessarily meet and dedicate whole day workshops, that's from like 8:30 to 4:30, to be part of like normal public servants would probably do. And so there's a need to be flexible in how we engage the private sector. So the use of one-on-one meetings, bilateral surveys, etc., are a good way of bridging that gap between the private sector and the public sector. And in so doing, what we do have a way of continuing to bridge that gap, and that would be through an action plan for private sector engagement, which looks at initiating, informing, incorporating, and involvement. That way, the private sector is not left behind when we look at climate change and climate change adaptation planning. When we speak of the private sector or private sector involvement, we not only look at climate change, but we look at other facets of sustainable development. One of our major initiatives that is led by the St. Lucia Development Bank is a climate change adaptation financing facility, the CAF, whose objective is to provide the private sector, civil society, and private citizens with access to financing at concessionary interest rates for building climate resilience. Under this financing facility, which is a pilot financing mechanism, at the end of 2018, there was an uptake of 9.6% of available funds, and those funds were loaned to individual households and businesses. And 77 of those approved loans, 56% went to female borrowers and 5.9% to business borrowers. You would note that there is probably a need for a little more engagement or involvement to get the private sector able to access those funds from the CAF. We also had earlier this year, a climate investment funds evaluation, and it looked at the learning on private sector responses to climate change. What was highlighted in this survey was that 73.1% of the businesses or the persons involved in businesses who were interviewed, they articulated a general understanding of climate change, and they are aware of the threats and vulnerabilities associated with climate change. However, a lot of that information, it seemed, is concentrated in managerial staff and not necessarily disseminated to lower level staff. So there is an opportunity for more awareness and engagement to bring out the climate change message to everyone. Like I mentioned, engagement with the private sector is not only limited to climate change, but we also have the Department of Sustainable Development, that is, has continued to engage the private sector in other aspects of sustainable development. That is through the phasing out of single-use plastic. We also have an example of a rainwater harvesting and sewage treatment and recycling system at Coconut Bay Resort and Spa. And of course, the aligning of the private sector with the other sustainable development goals. In conclusion, we will note that it is important that in order to sustain private sector engagement, there is a need for continued public awareness, forging opportunities for sustained engagement, and the use of non-traditional methods for engaging with the private sector. That's it from me.
Thanks so much, Nalia. So we're getting close to the hour, but we would like to give people a chance to ask a few questions. So thanks to those of you who've already shared your questions in the Q&A section, and feel free to add a few more. So the first question is for Diane. It's how has the experience been about the number of farmers? Have you found that, and this is the number of farmers engaging in cassava farming as part of Project Grow, has there been more interest than contracts are available, or have you found that given the stipulations in the cultivation practices that it's tough to find farmers for Project Grow?
Not at all difficult for us. In fact, we have had over the time an influx of requests for participation in the program. So that has never posed as a challenge for us. What we have, however, found is that we now are in competition with the BAMI industry. But BAMI is a pancake-styled meal that is used in Jamaica using cassava. And so there is a bit of competition there. And we have recognized that there is some amount of moving away from to, in breach of the contracts. But outside of that, we have never had a real issue with interest and more farmers wanting to get involved in the process.
Thanks for that. And just as a follow-up question, one participant mentioned, so this project is building the resilience of Red Stripe, and in terms of the farmers who are participating, how is their vulnerability and risk being analyzed, and what level of risk to fail do they face? Is there a risk for them due to climate change impacts?
So as I mentioned, we ensure that there is tremendous training and support to ensure that they are farming and harvesting in the best way that is going to will make their crops climate resistant. We also have extension officers who visit them on a regular basis, and we do provide that additional support for them. So they have been quite excited by the support that we provide, and as such follow through. If we find that they're in breach of those practices, we continue to assess, and even prior to engagement with them, we do assessments of where they're located, the type of soil that they have, and put in mitigation measures to support them.
Thanks very much. My next question is for Snalia. So Snalia, you mentioned in the CIF survey that awareness and general understanding of climate change is actually quite high among the private sector. And so my question is, when you're speaking with private sector representatives, what types of concerns are they voicing to you, and what do they want from government in terms of support on climate change adaptation?
One of the major issues, I would say, especially given the fact that many of the businesses are small, is financing. And so making the case for probably doing adaptation measures now, looking at the cost of those adaptation measures and the benefits, the future benefits, is what would need to be done. So how exactly can we make that case to the private sector that implementing measures now for the future is the way to go? And so one of the things that needs to be done is that the government needs to have or should continue with what is already being done, and that is continuous engagement with the private sector, inviting them to those meetings, sharing information. One of the major successes that we've had is that our climate change website, which is up and running, provides a lot of information for both public and private sector individuals, and they're able to get information, the necessary climate change information that they need. The Department of Sustainable Development is also always willing and able to answer any questions from the public. And so we're here to provide the support and guidance that is needed to ensure that going forward, the private sector is always fully kept abreast on climate change and climate change information.
Thanks very much. One final question for the Q&A section is another question for Diane. So one participant just wanted to ask and to confirm that the extension officers are government staff. And if so, are there any special programs or incentives for these extension officers?
No, they're actually hired through us. Initially, they were with government, but we have been able to work again with government to have them on our own payroll to ensure that they are easily accessible and readily available to them. So the incentives provided is one, they are working with Red Stripe, a private sector organization, and of course, they are salaried employees. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks very much. So I think that's all the time we have today. Unfortunately, it would be great to extend the conversation, but just as a final few points to wrap up, thanks so much again to our presenters, Alec, Diane, and Snalia. We've recorded this webinar and it will be posted on the NAP Global Network's website along with the PowerPoint presentations that you've just seen. There's a short evaluation survey that will launch at the end of the webinar and that will also be shared in a follow-up email to participants. We'd really appreciate if you could take a few minutes to share your feedback, which helps us to develop further webinars and hopefully continue improving what we're offering. Before we close, we'd also like to invite you, if you haven't joined the NAP Global Network already, to register on our website at napglobalnetwork.org, which you can see on the screen here. This is free, open to everyone, and you can do this on an individual basis. By joining, we'll be sure to keep you up to date on future webinars, publications, and knowledge products, as well as NAP-related news more broadly. So thank you again, and please don't hesitate to be in touch if you have any questions or are interested in learning more about how you can get involved. Have a great day, everyone.